Lord, will you anoint Paul this morning as he brings your word to us? Will you use what you have given him and speak to our ears and our hearts, Lord, that we may follow whatever you are speaking through Paul today. Amen.
Well, good morning. Yeah, I quite like that video as well, but I think you need to see it a couple of times because there's an awful lot in it, just like there's an awful lot in the Bible. It's pretty condensed. But the Bible begins by telling us that God created the world and it was good. And God created mankind, but mankind rebelled against God, against his rule in our lives, choosing to be Lord in our own lives, and our relationship with God was broken. And so evil entered the world. Sin, sickness, decay, and the rest is history. But God had a plan. And the Old Testament continues with the story of God's actions to redeem the world. Beginning in Genesis, where God tells the serpent that he shall bruise his head, but the serpent shall only bruise his heel. Today is the second Sunday in Advent. Last week, the first Sunday in Advent, we looked at the patriarchs, God beginning his plan to restore the world. He chose people, beginning with Abraham, promising that through his descendants, all nations would be blessed. And so we've lit the second candle today. And today we think about the prophets, those Old Testament characters who revealed more about God's plan to restore the world. People, as we've already heard from Jeanette, who foretold the birth of Jesus. Well, in the Old Testament, we find well over 300 such prophecies, intermingled with prophecies relating to the prophet's own time and situation. Often, the prophets themselves not realizing the meaning and accuracy of their predictions. So the Old Testament prophets, they look forward to events that happened in their lifetimes or in their day. They also point to events of the coming Messiah. And they also point forward to events that have yet to happen, often events that will happen when Jesus returns. And quite often, these prophecies are well jumbled together or have applications to one or two of these three times. And it's not always easy to untangle them. And Advent is a time of looking forward to the one who is to come. We look forward to the birth of Jesus, and we also look forward to Jesus' return. So in our reading today, fortunately, it's not too tangled up. Our reading today comes from the prophet Micah. And he's often overshadowed by the other prophets, such as Isaiah. So we're going to try and stick mainly with Micah today and see what he has to say. Well, Micah originated from the town of Moresheth, which is a village or small town about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. His book contains a series of prophecies made about 700 to 730 BC, which did indeed make him a contemporary of Isaiah. At this time, both Israel and Judah remember that they had split into two nations under the rule of David's grandchild. So both halves of the nation had turned away from God, and the prophet alternates prophecies of judgment and hope for restoration. And in particular, he rails against the corruption and injustice that was rampant in their society and perpetuated by their leaders. He says things like, "Hear this, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, who despise justice and distort all that is right, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money. Yet they look to the Lord's support and say, 'Is the Lord not among us? No disaster can come upon us.'" Their leaders were corrupt. Their justice system was corrupt. And their religion was corrupt. And yet they think that because they're supposedly God's people, that God would protect them. But the prophet predicts their defeat, their downfall, captivity and exile in a foreign land. And he tells them how they should be behaving. We have that well-known passage in chapter 6 of Micah. "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down? Shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." He prophesies the disaster that will come as a result of their sin. But interleaved between these prophecies, he looks forward to salvation after judgment, restoration after exile. And it's one of these passages that we read today where he predicts that a ruler will come from Bethlehem. As he notes in his prophecy that it's a small town. Its only claim to fame was that it was the hometown of King David and the setting for the story of David's great-grandparents, Ruth and Boaz. The ruling elite would expect a ruler to come from Jerusalem, not some small place. That was hardly more than a village. After all, David's royal line now resided in Jerusalem. But the ruling elite had become so self-satisfied that they no longer cared for anyone but themselves. And so God returns to David's roots in an insignificant village. Remember David being the most insignificant and youngest of his brothers. So much so that his father Jesse didn't even bother to fetch him when the prophet Samuel asked to see his children. True kingship, it would seem, has more to do with humility than with the power-hungry courts of kings. And so, as we look forward to the birth of the King of Kings, we see him being born in a stable to a poor, insignificant parents. Contrast this with Herod and his reaction. Herod the Great, when Jesus actually came, Herod was reminded by his advisors of this prophecy in Micah, and in response to the Magi's questions. Contrast his fearful reaction of a paranoid king murdering the innocents in Bethlehem. And history tells us also that he murdered members of his own family, including 2 of his children, as he felt that they were a threat and could possibly take away his throne. But God chose a stable. God chose a manger. God chose the little place. But back to Micah. Not from the expected city, but from the humble village, one would come for God, who would be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Was this from of old, from ancient times? Was this just another reference to David and his ancestry? Or was it a hint at something more? In John's introduction to his gospel, he writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And jumping on to verse 9, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world didn't recognize him. He came to that was his own, and his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision of a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So John writes, the Word became flesh, and was there in the beginning with God and part of God. And it was through that Word, Jesus. And without Jesus, nothing was made. Jesus was part of the creation process. Was Micah's prophecy that his origin was from of old, telling us that this ruler was to come indeed from the Ancient of Days, a title used for God in Daniel? But that passage I read from the beginning of John also tells us that many would receive him. And to those who believe, he gave the right to become children of God. That severing of relationship with God caused by our insistence on our own decision-making and control could be and would be, for those who believed in him, would be reversed. Returning to Micah, the prophecy continues in verses 3 and 4. "Until the time when she who is in labour bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to the Israelites, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God." We are reminded of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, leading all those who will believe in him, both Jew and Gentile. Micah's phrase, "He will stand and shepherd his flock," predicts that he will be active. We are not left out on our own to defend ourselves. If we are prepared to be led by him, then he will actively lead and shepherd us. John, in his vision, recorded in the book of Revelation, writes, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among his people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making all things new." At this Advent time, we remember and look forward to the coming of his Son as a baby. We look forward to God with us and the return of his Son as King and Judge. We remember God has a plan to restore the world, a plan to bring us back into relationship with him as his children. And as the prophets revealed that plan, we see that God's plan involved the unexpected, the overlooked, the poor, and the ordinary, people like you and me, to establish his rule of earth in our lives. God's plan, it would seem, requires us, as Micah puts it, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. God's plan is that he will dwell with us and he will be our shepherd. He doesn't leave us to struggle on our own. He sends his Holy Spirit to dwell with us until that time when he comes back fully and makes all things new. The people in Micah's day were so caught up in their lives that they didn't see or care about the injustices going on in their society. We can easily get caught up in this Advent season with the commercialism or even with the preparations for Christmas that we forget what God really requires. Perhaps we need to stand back and ask what God requires in our society. What to act justly and to love mercy and walk humbly with our God means for us. We have a choice as to whether we want to be part of God's plan, to receive him, to be one of those who believed in his name and accepted his rule and become children of God. We have that choice. What are we going to decide? Let's stand and pray.